A warning to all listeners that this podcast will discuss residential and day schools and contains sensitive and distressing information. For those experiencing intergenerational trauma or are triggered by the following information, the Residential School Survivors Society can be contacted toll-free at 1-800-721-0066. That's 1-800-721-0066. A 24-hour National Residential School Crisis Line can also be contacted at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. Segon, Ani Bojo. Hello, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to the first episode of this 5-part series that will explore the United Church's involvement in the residential and day school systems. I'm Hannah, a Ganyatkehaga woman, and for the past 2 summers, I've been working as a summer student for the United Church of Canada's Canadian Shield Regional Council's Right Relations team. I believe in transparency, holding colonial institutions accountable, and making archival materials available to Indigenous communities. If we are, indeed, in the era of reckoning and reconciliation, the bare minimum the institutions that have participated in forced assimilation and colonization can do is to be honest and open. That's why last summer I decided to embark on an extensive research project on the role the United Church of Canada played in the residential and day school systems, and how moving forward the Church intends to live up to its 1998 apology. The culmination of this research is this podcast, which, as I said, will be a 5-part series released in the weeks leading up to Orange Shirt Day on September 30th. The goal of this podcast is to educate you on a part of Canada's and the United Church's history, which has shamefully been swept under the rug and avoided for too long, and to provide some insight on how we all play a role in reconciliation. You are currently listening to the first episode, where I will provide some background on the creation of the United Church and how they got involved in the residential and day school systems. In 1831, the first church-run residential school opened in Brantford, Ontario. The school was formerly called the Mohawk Institute, but is known by many as the Mush Hole. In 1884, the Canadian government made amendments to the Indian Act, which resulted in the creation of government and church-funded residential schools. Participating churches included the Roman Catholic, Anglican, Methodist, Presbyterian, and later United Churches. A further amendment was made to the Indian Act in 1920, which made it mandatory for all Indigenous children between the ages of 7 and 16 to attend residential school. Over the course of more than 150 years, over 150,000 children attended these schools, and according to the Truth and Reconciliation findings, more than 4,100 children died. It is important to note that this estimation is based on documentation that the TRC were able to see. Many records have been destroyed or gone missing, and at times, some deaths would not be reported. In 1996, the Gordon Residential School in Saskatchewan, the last residential school in operation, was closed. The United Church of Canada was created in 1925 after 4 Protestant denominations merged, including the Methodist Church, the Congregational Union, 2/3 of the Presbyterian Church, and the Association of Local Union Churches. As a result of the merger, the United Church inherited 12 residential schools. In total, the United Church ran 14 residential schools between 1925 to 1969, when at this point, the schools either closed or were taken over by the federal government or another church. In Ontario, there was one school run by the United Church of Canada, Mount Elgin Industrial Institute, or Munsee Institute. It was located in Munsee, Ontario, on the territory of the Chippewas of the Thames First Nation, number 42, and bordered on the Oneida Nation of the Thames. The school was in operation between 1849 to 1946, making it one of the first residential schools in Canada. In a 1942 report, the Superintendent of Welfare and Training called the building one of the most dilapidated structures I have ever inspected. In Manitoba, the church operated 3 schools. In Rossville, Manitoba, located on the territory of Norway House Reserve No. 17, Norway House Indian Residential School was in operation. It was opened between 1900 to 1967. Travel to the school was done via canoe, and the journey would take more than 8 days. Portage-la Prairie Indian Residential School was located in Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba, and was in operation between 1886 to 1960. In 1980, the land and buildings were transferred to Long Plain First Nation and became Long Plain Indian Reserve No. 6. And the Brandon Industrial Institute was located in Brandon, Manitoba. It was opened between 1895 to 1972, and they took children from the Lake Winnipeg region, but they also expanded their enrollment to children from Ontario and Saskatchewan. There were 2 schools in Saskatchewan. Round Lake Indian Residential School was located in Round Lake, Saskatchewan, and it was opened between 1886 to 1950. In 1929, one of the teachers, Lucy Affleck, wrote the United Church of Canada Superintendent of Indian Missions, and she stated that the students were cold, the food was inadequate, there was little clean water, 9 out of 10 children had tuberculosis, and the principal was absorbing the salaries of unfilled teaching positions. And File Hills Indian Residential School was located in Belcaire, Saskatchewan, on the present-day Oconese Indian Reserve. It operated between 1889 to 1949, and upon graduation, they wanted students to live at the File Hills Colony, a planned Christian community where male students would be given an 80-acre farm. In the Bryce report, Dr. Peter Bryce stated that 75% of students at the school had died, mostly from tuberculosis. There were another 3 schools operated by the church in Alberta. In Red Deer, Alberta, the Red Deer Industrial Institute was open from 1893 to 1919, and it was replaced by the Edmonton Indian Residential School in Edmonton, Alberta, which was opened between 1924 to 1966. Enrollment at the school expanded to communities in northern British Columbia, and these students often suffered due to the distance from their home communities, cultural differences, and discrimination. The DIA ended up suspending holidays for these students, meaning families would not see their children for years. And the Morley Indian Residential School was located in Morleyville, Alberta, close to Stoney First Nation Reserve. It was open from 1926 to 1969. The school, like many other residential schools, was overcrowded and has faced allegations of severe corporal punishment, physical abuse, and sexual abuse. And finally, the church operated 5 schools in British Columbia. In Sardi, British Columbia, the Coquitlam Industrial Institute was open from 1886 to 1940. This was the largest residential school in BC. And part of the site has been made into offices for the nation, with negotiations to convert the land into the reserve still underway. Alberni Indian Residential School was located on Vancouver Island and was open between 1891 to 1973. I will be discussing the allegations and findings at the school in a future episode, but a course case involving one of the supervisors at the school prompted BC Supreme Court Justice Douglas Hogarth to call the residential school system a form of institutionalized pedophilia. The Ahusat Indian Residential School operated on Flores Island on the land of the Marktosis Indian Reserve No. 15 between 1904 to 1940. It closed after a fire caused the school to burn down. In Port Simpson, British Columbia, the Port Simpson Crosby Girls and Boys Home was open from 1879 to 1948. And at the home, there were no academic classes, and the children were not allowed summer vacations. And finally, in Kitimat, British Columbia, the Kitimat Elizabeth Long Memorial Home operated from 1893 to 1941. In 1922, parents discovered that 49 of the 99 children had died and called for the dismissal of the staff. The home was eventually closed and a day school was built in place. As I said then, the United Church of Canada ran 14 residential schools, 2 of which were considered residences, where children from outside of the community would live when attending day schools. These were Port Simpson Crosby Girls and Boys Home and Kitimat Elizabeth Long Memorial Home. The majority, if not all, of the residential schools run by the church focused their classes and learning on farming and home care, not academic training. The church also ran many day schools across the country, too many to name and discuss in great detail in this podcast. But the Federal Indian Day School Class Action released a document that lists every single day school that existed in Canada with some information on each one. In regards to United Church-run day schools, there were 9 in Alberta, 18 in British Columbia, 30 in Manitoba, 27 in Ontario, 2 in Quebec, and 14 in Saskatchewan. In total, the church ran 100 day schools. The difference with day schools is that the majority of students remained in their communities and would go home in the evening, with the exception of students that were taken from farther away communities. It is important to note that the day schools were also operated by the federal government and the churches, and many students experienced widespread abuse at these schools. There is a lot of research currently being done in regards to Canadian day schools, which includes the United Church of Canada's process of publishing archival material. There is currently a claims process underway for the class action settlement regarding federal day schools. It is very important to note that government and church officials knew about the poor conditions, mental, physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, and the deaths occurring at these schools. Dr. Peter Bryce was appointed as medical inspector to the Department of the Interior and of Indian Affairs in 1904, and 3 years later, he inspected 35 schools in Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and Alberta. His inspection included File Hills, which you'll remember was one of the schools inherited by the United Church. What he found was that 24% of the students attending residential school had died, and at File Hills, that statistic rose to 75%. He delivered his report to the Department of Indian Affairs, complete with a list of recommendations of how to improve the conditions at the institutions. The recommendations included improving the facilities, establishing the schools closer to the home reserves, that the studies followed the provincial curriculums, and that the health of students be guarded by a proper medical inspection. He also investigated the rampant tuberculosis endemic at the schools and found that it caused an excessive mortality rate. However, these recommendations were ignored based in large part due to the advice of none other than Duncan Campbell Scott. And if you don't know who Duncan Campbell Scott is, he was the superintendent of the Department of Indian Affairs from 1913 to 1932. He was famously quoted as saying, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department." In 1914, when Duncan Campbell Scott gained control of the department, he stopped Dr. Peter Bryce's reports altogether, claiming they were too expensive and the recommendations would be disregarded anyways. But Dr. Peter Bryce would not be silenced. In 1922, he published a short pamphlet, The Story of a National Crime, which discussed his investigations, reports, recommendations, and his experience with Duncan Campbell Scott and the Department of Indian Affairs. It was made available for 32 cents a copy, which today is about $5.50. But on top of this, Indigenous communities and the parents of students continuously voiced their concerns. In 1922, parents of students at Kitimat Elizabeth Long Memorial Home called for the dismissal of the staff after discovering that almost 50% of the students had died while at the home. And in 1943, Chippewas of the Thames First Nation delivered 5 sworn statements against Mount Elgin Industrial Institute in Ontario, complaining about poor diet and spoiled food, lack of medical care, severe strapping and physical abuse, and poor winter clothing. And, in addition to Dr. Peter Bryce's investigations, there were numerous inspections at many of the schools that called for either the buildings to be demolished or for new facilities or renovations to happen. The majority of these recommendations were ignored, and in some places, the disregard for these warnings resulted in catastrophic fires. A 1910 inspection at Norway House, for instance, stated the school was at risk of fire, and 3 years later, the school burned down. A new building was constructed after the fire. As you can see, the federal government and the churches knew about the extensive abuse happening at these schools, yet chose to keep these institutions running. And Duncan Campbell Scott's "I want to get rid of the Indian problem" quote is an admission of knowingly participating in assimilative policies and an act of, to use the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's verbiage, cultural genocide. But despite these hard facts, there are still a lot of misinformed and pervasive beliefs surrounding the schools, which I will be discussing in an episode coming out next week. The last residential school closed in 1996, and the last day school was transferred to community control in 2000. This isn't a distant historical event. It happened in many of our lifetimes, and the survivors and their families are still experiencing the effects of these institutions. But for now, I hope this episode has provided some background on residential and day schools. As I said, an episode where I tackle some misinformed beliefs surrounding the schools will be out next week. Once more, for those experiencing intergenerational trauma or are triggered by the information in this podcast, the Residential School Survivors Society can be contacted toll-free at 1-800-721-0066. That's 1-800-721-0066. And a 24-hour national residential school crisis line can also be contacted at 1-866-925-4419. Again, that's 1-866-925-4419. Niawa, Chimigwech. Thank you for listening.